hello everybody, and welcome to our latest edition of Infection Control Matters. It's Brett Mitchell here again, and today we are going to start, hopefully, what will be a series of discussions with presenters from the IPS Conference. I'd love to say I'm live from IPS Liverpool, but I'm not. But what I do have is a special guest who is live from Liverpool for the IPS Conference, Dr Evonne Curran. Welcome, Evonne.
Thank you very much. Delightful to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. And so the IPS conference kicks off in about an hour and a half's time, and we've managed to nab Evonne, who's presenting later today. Actually, no, it's tomorrow, I believe. Tomorrow, my fault, tomorrow. And we're going to hear a little bit of the background to her talk. Now, this podcast will be posted after she's done her IPS talk, but it's great that Evonne's going to talk to us today. So Dr. Evonne Curran's career began in infection control in 1987, and she was the lead for the outbreak program work at Health Protection Scotland. She's now an independent nurse consultant for infection prevention and control, and she's an honorary senior research fellow at Glasgow Caledonian University. And Evonne's talk at the IPS conference, and what we're going to chat about today, is called Guideline Development: What Let Us Down? So, Evonne, what has let us down with guideline development?
This is one where, just my computer's butting in there. This is one where I could be pelted with oranges, but I'm going to risk it.
I won't pelt you with any oranges. I can't throw that far anyway, so you're okay.
Infection prevention and control recommendations in evidence-based guidelines tend to be good practice points, which is a little different from good old boys sat around the table that went before. And that leads to the accusations that the evidence base is poor, and because the evidence base is poor, really doesn't need to be followed that much. And it also, evidence-based guidelines are kind of on a pedestal. You have to do RCTs, it has to be up there. That's the only game in town, and these things are without fault. And so you're in a situation. So that was the sort of inspiration for the start. And I went looking for loopholes. So methodologically, there's two catch-22s. And the first one is, if you read any of these guidelines, they're forever telling you they use robust procedures. Robust, you should do a word count on robust, it's big. And if you find a fault and you say that there's a mistake here, you say, yeah, we follow robust procedures. So that's catch-22 number one. And catch-22 number two is that the evidence from IPC studies is generally considered insufficiently robust, and we're told to do more robust studies, where it's clearly unethical to do robust studies. And sometimes there's deference to expertise. So I went looking for loopholes and errors, and I found them. I found them in the outputs. Sometimes they're impenetrable and imprecise, and sometimes the recommendations are overstated. And sometimes some of the basics, the really basics of IPC, is left behind. And it's not like you can go, okay, so this is the evidence-based guideline. I'll just now go to another guideline, which has got all the answers that the first guideline didn't have. So that's why I think there are problems and why they let us down.
Yeah. Look, I could talk about this all day with you. This is very close to my heart, Evonne, as well. Do you want to give us an example of perhaps something that's let us down? Yeah.
So there was a very nice respiratory guideline review produced in 2013, and it quoted the oft-quoted CDC guideline for the split between droplets and aerosols published in 2007. Now, if you go take a look at that, it cites the evidence to Jugged in 1946, and Jugged cites the evidence to Hatch in 1942. And if you go and get Hatch, he didn't mention a size cutoff point at all. So we all entered the pandemic with guidance which had misrepresented studies done during the war, and hence the blow up of what happened from that. Yeah. I can also give you an example of the TB guideline, which gives different recommendations with regard to PPE. This is a nice guideline with regard to PPE and isolation precautions based on the drug sensitivity of TB, when in actual fact, they're both spread the same way the transmissibility is exactly the same. And that can never make sense.
No, that's right. And I've heard you talk about parachute evidence before. And what do you sort of mean by this concept of parachute evidence?
So parachute evidence is the work of Smith and Pell. And they said, we went looking, and when they did the process, we went looking for evidence that from randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews that jumping out of a plane with or without a parachute on, what was the difference with regard to gravitational challenge and death, or serious injury and death due to the gravitational challenge? And there was none. Surprise, surprise. There has since been one study, which was a BMJ Christmas edition, so we could put that one to bed because we're
going to talk about that one.
The plane never left the ground, so we can park that. But in actual fact, there is evidence for parachutes because of Newton. Gravity is explained. It's not explained by RCTs, but it is explained by physics and maths. Yeah. And I think for some sciences or some facts, some phenomena, we need to explain them with randomized controlled trials. But for others, we need to look for different paradigms for evidence.
And, COVID's been a case in point. It's really highlighted our gaps in our fundamental thoughts about some of these and in the past. So, that's in my space of the world, I guess, has changed a lot over the last 12 months. But, it's, as you say, it's a sort of catch-22 because, there also hasn't been a lot of interest and a lot of research in infection control for a long time too. And there hasn't been those studies. I'm not saying we need RCTs for everything, but it's that sort of catch-22. We're in this paradigm of going round and round circles and not seeing the wood for the trees. In fact, your talk's going to dovetail nicely into my talk at IPS Conference on Wednesday, because I talk about this a bit more too, so it's going to be fascinating. So perhaps the next step for us is to think about where did the process go wrong? What are your thoughts on that?
I think when we do a systematic review and looking for randomized controlled trials, we always start with the questions. And actually, I think we need to get further upstream. There's always the size of the problem, and infection prevention and control wins hands down. HAI is a big problem. There was another big study recently, how much it costs. So we win hands down, and there's a case to be answered, if you will. But the second part is, why does that happen? What is happening to cause it? And when you take a look, the actual theoretical framework as the basis for these guidelines, as published, appears to be quite weak. And I think if we had a really good theoretical framework, now there's a recent guideline just came out for consultation, an MRSA guideline, and it said MRSA is spread by multiple routes, something of those words. That's not enough. What routes is it spread by? How is it spread? How does it go from A to B? We need to be really explicit if we're ever going to get to the right questions, if we're ever going to get to the right answers.
Yeah, because those questions and those right answers then have major implications, not just for guideline development and what we do as clinicians in terms of what we recommend, or as a clinician, what you're going to practice, but also much more broadly for health services. If we think about design of buildings, or if we talk about really true hierarchy of controls, we can actually engineer out some of these risks if we get some of this critical stuff right in the first place. Absolutely.
There's a poster that will be at conference that talks about how you make an isolation room, in inverted commas, in a 4-bedded area. Rather than say, this is how we kicked the CEO's door down to demand that we have enough cubicles. And whenever there have been quality indicators, they tend to be things that we can blame frontline workers for, cases of this, or number of times they do hand hygiene. Why don't we have indicators that say something like, how many times do we have failures to isolate because of inadequate isolation facilities? Because that's the manager's quality indicator. And that's leading to, and just like you say, if we have the facilities, if we have the practice, we wouldn't have to do half as much in practice if we had the right facilities.
That's right. And I'm sure there's many people who listening to this who would love that example, because on a day-to-day basis, they're faced with these to help contribute to decisions about, well, who gets X room or Y room in the context of not just infections, but mental health related conditions, dementia and cognition related challenges, palliation, and these are difficult things. And so ultimately people are forced to make decisions, not forced, but the infrastructure is not there to make the decisions that actually need to be made in the first
totally
place.
agree. And I think that's important. When we're going to do guidance, we do it in the context of what we need to practice in. That's vital.
So you talked about theoretical framework, and is that what we need to do? Do we need to look at what needs to happen in that space?
Absolutely. And I think I've kind of put a starter for 10 of a theoretical framework in the presentation. And because there is evidence, there is microbiological evidence to support the case, but we just need to make it absolutely explicit. So we need to know where the pathogens come from. That we state explicit where the pathogens come from that cause cross-transmission and HCAI, and then how does transmission occur, and how does entry occur? They're different. And then what are the prevention strategies, and how do we achieve that? And one of the big things is that we in infection control are always working where there is a plurality of risks and a plurality of actions needed. And we have to accept that. We can't just do one thing. We have to that's the field that we're in. And I think because there is this plurality of actions and plurality of control measures, it's much harder for the likes of EPIC to come up with and say, yeah, the environment is heavily involved, or this is heavily involved. You can't. You can just come up with they're all in the picture, but we can't identify in any given case the particular size of any individual problem.
Yeah, and look, I think I might have mentioned this on a podcast I've done before, but a great example of that at the other end of the spectrum, when you're talking about researchers who are trying to do research in this space, they get slammed by reviewers for not being able to control some of these things, and then you don't get the grants to do these things. Now, these things are extremely hard to control, and we can talk about methods another day. But to do it well is very hard, and you can't. And quite often, I sort of say, what does it matter if there's 4 things that we need to do to improve patient safety for this particular aspect? Do we have to necessarily unpick what the individual value of every single one of those is, if in their totality they work, but we know that one of them perhaps doesn't work as well in isolation? So we do get caught up, but that's a challenge, because as researchers, that's the paradigm that they live in, and me at times too. And it's balanced by what's pragmatic and real life, and what's ethically able to be done in the context of clinical research. It's not ethical. We're not going to have I give this really blunt example to students at times, and I say, would you go into an RCT where the person you're using bloodied, soiled scalpels and surgical equipment from the previous person? Of course, you're not going to do that. We don't need an RCT to prove it, that you shouldn't do that, nor would you ever ethically do that. So that doesn't mean that the evidence is poor, that we need to sterilise equipment. So, I guess they're just some other examples to probably support what you're saying, Evonne, on that approach. So what do you think? Does this mean we don't need research, or what do we need?
Absolutely, we need research. It just means that maybe we do a different type of research, or our starting point is different. If we really got the theoretical framework nailed that everyone was in agreement with, and I think that will take maybe multiple universities, maybe lots of different people working together. If we had that now, then our research questions become clearer and more workable, and some we'll be able to do with RCTs, but not all of them.
And so what do you see as this going from here? What do you see as...
I was kind of stuck with a problem without a solution. And then Prof Greenhow came up with the solution, and it was one of these papers that, lights and bells and whistles all went off. This is the answer. And so the paper was entitled, "Is COVID going to be evidence-based guidelines nemesis?" Because when you stand back, how can we prepare for an organism that we've never had before, that we've never experienced before, that's never been as communicable before? And she has come up with this complex systems paradigm. And there's a lovely table in her paper where she compares the evidence-based medicine paradigm with the complex systems paradigm. And some of the lines that she uses, emergent causality, multiple interacting influences account for a particular outcome, but none can have a fixed size or effect. And there's another line, which is multiple perspective, viewing complex systems as moving targets. I don't think anything describes as beautifully the field of infection control over the last however many years than these statements. It's amazing that it has come up with that. And she says that good research in the complex systems paradigm is identified by strong theory, flexible methods, and pragmatic adaptation to emerging circumstances. The data are never going to be complete. We're never going to be able to tie it up with a bow and say it was the stethoscope with the MRSA in the cubicle. That's not going to happen. But if we have our strong theory and we continually review it by all the new evidence that comes up, it will over time need little adaptation. It will be like the gravity. Once it's accepted, yes, they've added to it over time, but not to any great extent. The work was done.
Yeah. And I think, one of those key elements that you touched on intrinsic to that is working in the context of being multiple perspectives. When, I guess, designing research, but also when thinking about interpreting that research and what that actually means as well for policy, for clinicians, etc. Well, Evonne, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you about this. So we could probably chat all day about this. Are there any final thoughts that you might have?
Well, apart from gravity works, don't leave a plane without a parachute, I think what I'm arguing for is this blended approach. We need RCTs. We're not suggesting they go out the way, but there are times when we need other forms of research, and we need to understand it. But our theoretical framework for anything we do, we need to really nail down and make it explicit.
Yeah, fantastic. Look, Evonne, thanks so much for giving up your time. I hope the talk goes well.
Thank you for asking me.
Thank you. Of course, haven't quite done at the time of this recording, but for those listening and who are registered for the IPS conference, you'll be able to see Evonne's full talk. But hopefully we've got a nice taster today for what that's all about. So thanks very much, Evonne, on behalf of our listeners. And thank you again, everybody, for listening. It's